Have you ever whispered a name into a prayer and then forgotten it by lunch? A name on a list somebody handed you. A stranger's mother, sick in a hospital you'll never see. Do you think that prayer just evaporates? Dissolves into the air the second you stop thinking about it? What if it doesn't? What if the moment you say, "I'll pray for you," even for someone you'll never meet, never see, never know by face, something happens that you were never told about? Something real, something measured, something Padre Pio saw with his own eyes, not once, but 1,000 times. This is not a story about being polite when someone asks for your prayers. This is about a current that runs between souls you will never meet, and what Padre Pio watched move through it, decade after decade, from a small friary in the mountains of southern Italy. Before we go any further, if this is reaching you, take a moment to subscribe, so the next thing Padre Pio saw finds you too. You've said it 100 times. I'll keep you in my prayers. Someone tells you their father is sick, or their marriage is breaking, or they just can't get out of bed some mornings. And you say it, and you mean it, mostly. And then the moment passes. The name blurs. You move on with your day. You've probably never once asked yourself what that promise actually does, not the feeling of saying it. The thing itself. The mechanism. What happens, in the world you can't see, the instant you form a stranger's name into a prayer and let it go? Most people treat prayer for a stranger like a coin tossed into a well. A nice gesture. Something that costs you 30 seconds and maybe makes you feel a little better about yourself. You don't expect an echo. You don't expect it to land anywhere in particular. You certainly don't expect it to reach the person sitting in a hospital bed 3,000 miles away, who never even knew your name. That's the blind spot. That's the thing almost no one is told. And it's the thing Padre Pio spent 50 years watching happen, over and over, until he stopped being surprised by it at all. Padre Pio was a man who lived with one foot in this world and the other in the next. That's not a poetic way of describing him. It's closest to the literal truth of his life. He bore the wounds of the crucifixion in his own hands, feet, and side for 50 years, bleeding quietly under bandages. He changed himself, refusing every offer of medical explanation, refusing every reporter who wanted the story. He spent up to 16 hours a day inside a wooden confessional, hearing the sins of strangers who traveled across Europe just to kneel in front of him. He didn't use gentle words when he could use true ones. People who met him expecting comfort sometimes left in tears, not because he was cruel, but because he seemed to already know exactly what they hadn't said out loud yet. That's the man who watched what happens when a stranger prays for you. Not a theologian, guessing from a library. A man who sat, day after day, in the seam between the visible world and the world behind it, and reported, plainly, what he saw crossing over. He saw it. Padre Pio saw it happen, again and again, in the confessional, in his letters, in the small stone room where he prayed before dawn. A prayer offered for someone you have never met does not vanish. It does not weaken with distance. It arrives. This is not superstition. This is not a metaphor dressed up to sound spiritual. The Church has a name for the reality underneath it. The communion of saints, the teaching that every believer, living and dead, is bound together in one living body, so that what one soul does in prayer genuinely touches another, even across oceans, even across silence, even when the person being prayed for has no idea a stranger ever said their name. Padre Pio lived inside that teaching so completely that it stopped being doctrine to him and became simply what he saw. Letters came to his friary by the thousands, from soldiers, from mothers, from people dying in hospital wards who had never set foot in Italy, asking only for one thing: pray for me. And he did. Thousands of people he would never meet in the flesh, whose faces he would never see, whose voices he would never hear, and he prayed for them anyway, and reported that the prayer reached them, not eventually, not vaguely. He saw it land. There's a woman, you can picture her, because she could be anyone, could be someone in your own family, who kept a small notebook by her bed. Every night before sleep, she wrote down names, not people she knew, names given to her by others, a coworker's brother in the hospital, a stranger's child having surgery, a name scrawled on a card left at the back of a church. She prayed through the list every night for years, and she never expected an answer, because she never expected to hear from any of them again. One evening, a woman approached her after Mass, someone she didn't recognize, and said, "You don't know me, but my son was on a list once. Someone told me a stranger had been praying for him every night for a year. I think it might have been you." She hadn't remembered the name. She'd written down hundreds by then. But Padre Pio taught something that explains exactly what happened in that gap. Heaven doesn't need you to remember. Heaven only needs you to have said it once, with your whole heart turned toward it. He would grab a hand sometimes, hold it, and say, "Do you know what you just did?" Most people didn't. Most people still don't. This is not a story about a woman with a good memory. This is about a current that keeps flowing long after you've forgotten you opened it. But what he saw next was harder for people to accept. Padre Pio didn't just teach that prayer for a stranger reaches them. He taught, and lived, something stranger still, that the prayer can cost you something, and that the cost is part of what makes it real. He spoke of carrying the weight of souls he prayed for, of feeling in his own body some measure of what they suffered. Friars close to him described nights when he seemed physically exhausted, not from his own pain, but from someone else's, someone whose name he had taken up in prayer and refused to set down. This is not fantasy. This is not poetry laid over an ordinary act of kindness. Padre Pio saw praying for another person as entering into their burden, not just wishing it away from a safe distance, not casually, not mechanically, but with the full weight of what it means to stand in for someone else before God, even when they never asked you directly, even when they don't know your face. Think about what that means for the person who prayed for you once, and you never knew it. Somewhere, right now, someone you have never met may be carrying your name. A friend of a friend. Someone at a prayer group who heard your situation secondhand and decided, quietly, to hold you up. You will likely never learn their name. You may never sense the moment it happened. But Padre Pio taught that the not knowing doesn't diminish it. If anything, it purifies it. A prayer with no thanks coming, no recognition waiting, offered simply because someone believed it would reach you. There's a story often told among those who knew him, a soldier during the Second World War, far from home, in the kind of danger that makes men stop believing in almost everything. He had no devotion to speak of. He hadn't prayed since he was a boy. But somewhere behind the front line, in a place he could not have known about, his mother had begun a novena for him. 9 days of prayer, repeated and repeated, to a saint she trusted, for a son she had no way of protecting with her own hands. He came home. He always said, later in his life, that he couldn't explain why he'd survived what he survived, except that something outside of him seemed to be pulling him through it. His mother never told him about the novena until years afterward. When she finally did, he wept, not because he suddenly understood the danger he'd been in, but because he realized someone had been fighting for him in a battle he never even knew was happening at the same time as his own. This is the world behind this one, not a metaphor. A world laid directly over this one, where names are spoken and carried and answered on a timeline you were never shown. Padre Pio didn't invent that world. He simply saw it more clearly than almost anyone else alive in his century, and he spent his life trying to tell people it was real. He saw it. He saw prayers land on people who had stopped believing entirely. He saw graces arrive at exactly the moment they were needed, offered by someone who would never know the outcome. He saw the current running both directions, the stranger who prays and the stranger who is prayed for, bound together for a moment. Neither of them would ever fully understand on this side of the veil. Padre Pio believed something else about this current, something he spoke of quietly and rarely to strangers, only to those closest to him. He believed the angels carried it, not metaphorically. He kept a devotion to his own guardian angel his entire adult life, spoke to that angel the way you'd speak to a friend standing beside you, and told the friars who lived with him that he sent his angel on errands, to comfort someone far away, to whisper a warning, to carry a message he had no other way of delivering. He believed every person had one. He believed those angels could move between two people who had never met and never would, carrying a prayer the way a hand carries a lit candle through a dark room, careful not to let it go out. That's not folklore stitched onto his story after the fact. Friars who lived beside him for decades wrote it down while he was still alive, because he told them plainly, without embarrassment, the way you'd mention a phone call you'd made that morning. He saw it as ordinary. He saw it as simply how the world worked, one layer beneath the layer you can touch. Do you see where this leads? If a prayer for a stranger can travel that far, carried by something with wings you'll never see, then the smallest, quietest prayer you've ever said for someone you don't know has already gone farther than you imagined. Not eventually. Already. There was a man, the kind of man who would have laughed at everything you've just heard. He didn't believe in any of it. Hadn't set foot inside a church since he was a boy, dragged there by a grandmother he barely remembered. He was hard in the way men get hard when life has taken more from them than it's given back. A friend of his, worried about him, worried about the drinking and the silence and the way he'd stopped answering calls, began praying for him without ever telling him. Every night, by name, for over a year. He didn't know. There was no dramatic moment where he felt a hand on his shoulder or heard a voice in the dark. What happened instead was smaller and stranger and harder to explain away. He started noticing things, a stray thought that stopped him before he did something he'd have regretted, a stranger's kindness on a day he'd planned to disappear entirely, a memory of his grandmother's church that came to him, uninvited, at 3 a.m. and wouldn't leave. He never learned, for years, that any of it had a cause outside his own mind. When he finally did, when the friend, dying herself, finally told him what she'd been doing every night for over a year, he didn't have a tidy explanation for what had shifted in him. He only knew that something had. Padre Pio would have told him exactly what it was. Not luck, not coincidence stacking on coincidence. A current running quietly beneath a life that thought it was alone, carried by someone who never once asked to be thanked. This is not therapy dressed up as faith. This is not wishful thinking given a candle and a pew to sit in. The Church has always taught that no prayer offered in love is wasted, that the living and the dead, and the ones still fighting their way through an ordinary Tuesday, are bound into one body, so that what is given in one corner of it is felt, somehow, in another. Padre Pio didn't have to take that on faith the way you might. He said he saw it. Every single day, for 50 years, in a small room that smelled of incense and old wood, he watched prayers arrive at their destination, like letters that had never been lost in the mail. But there's a warning folded into all of this, and it matters more than the wonder does. Padre Pio never taught that a prayer works like a spell, that saying the right words, the right number of times, forces heaven's hand the way you'd flip a switch and expect a light to come on. He was fierce about that distinction. A prayer for a stranger is not a transaction. It doesn't obligate God the way a coin obligates a vending machine. It's closer to love than to mechanism, an act that only means anything because it's freely given, freely received, and entirely trusted to hands other than your own. That's why the woman with the notebook, the mother with her novena, the friend who prayed for a year in silence, none of them controlled what happened next. None of them could have. What they did was simpler and, in its way, harder. They gave something away without any promise of return. And Padre Pio saw, again and again, that this is exactly the kind of prayer heaven seems to lean toward hardest. Not the loud one, not the desperate bargain, but the quiet one offered for someone who will never know your name. There's one more kind of prayer Padre Pio spoke about differently than all the others. The prayer said for someone in their final hours, someone who has no strength left to pray for themselves. He believed those prayers carried a particular weight, because they're offered at the exact moment a soul is most exposed, most in need of another voice to speak on its behalf. He told the friars that at the hour of death, the veil between the two worlds grows thin enough that what's said on this side is heard almost instantly on the other. A family once sat around a bed in a hospital room 300 miles from his friary, watching a grandmother slip toward the end without a priest anywhere near, without the words spoken over her that she'd wanted her whole life. Someone in that family remembered a story about a friar in Italy who prayed for strangers, and in desperation, more out of habit than conviction, wrote his name into a letter and mailed it, though there was no way it would arrive before she died. It didn't arrive before she died. The letter reached the friary weeks later, but something in that family's account, passed down afterward, insisted that in the final hour the grandmother's face changed. The fear left it, replaced by something closer to peace, and she said, clearly, to no one visible in the room, "Someone is praying for me." No one in that room had told her about the letter. No one had said his name aloud in front of her. Padre Pio never claimed to know exactly how these things travel, or on what timeline, or by what means. He only insisted that they do. Not immediately, not dramatically every time, but they arrive. A prayer said for a stranger's final hour does not wait for the postal service. It moves by a road with no distance on it at all. Think now about every name you've ever let slip past you without a second thought. The coworker who mentioned a diagnosis in passing, the stranger's photograph on a prayer chain forwarded in a group text you almost didn't open, the name on a card at the back of a church you visited once, out of curiosity, years ago. You have no idea what any of those prayers, if you said them, might have done. You were never meant to know. That not knowing is not a flaw in the system. Padre Pio taught that it might be the whole point, a current that asks nothing back, not even the satisfaction of watching it work. And there is a harder truth folded inside the gentler one. If your prayer for a stranger can reach that far, then someone else's prayer for you has likely already reached farther than you think. Somewhere, at some point in your life you may not even remember clearly, a stranger held your name for reasons you'll never learn. A moment you walked away from a decision that would have cost you everything, and never understood why. A night you should have been alone with something unbearable, and instead felt, faintly, that you weren't. You were taught to call that luck. Padre Pio would have told you to call it what it actually was. Padre Pio called the rosary the weapon for these times, not a comfort, not a ritual to make you feel better before bed, but a weapon of defense, something built for a real fight against a real enemy. Near the end of his life, when the friars searched through his habit looking for whatever it was he carried closest to him, they found only his rosary beads worn smooth from 50 years of use. He looked at them and said, "And is this not a weapon?" He meant it about more than his own soul. He meant that every prayer, said with intention, enters a battle already underway. A battle for a stranger's mind in the moment before they give up, for a marriage in the hour it's deciding whether to survive, for a soul on a hospital bed deciding, in ways none of us can measure, whether to keep fighting for one more day. When you pray for someone you've never met, you are not sending good thoughts into empty air. You are picking up a weapon and stepping, uninvited, into a fight that was already happening, whether you noticed it or not. That changes what it costs you to say the words. It should. A prayer said carelessly, half-formed, mind already wandering to your grocery list, is not nothing. Padre Pio never taught that God despises small or clumsy prayers, but it is not the same as a prayer said with your full attention turned toward a name. He would grab the arm of someone leaving confession too casually and ask, "Do you know what you just did?" He asked it because most people don't. Most people treat the sacred like background noise, something they can half attend to while thinking about something else. Tonight, before you sleep, there is likely a name already sitting somewhere in your memory. Someone mentioned in passing. A stranger's child, a coworker's mother, a name on a card, a name in a text thread, a name you promised to remember and already half forgot. You don't need their permission to pray for them. You don't need to know their face, their voice, their whole story. Padre Pio prayed for thousands of people whose faces he never saw in his life, and he told everyone who would listen that distance changes nothing about how far a real prayer travels. Somewhere tonight, someone you've never met might be sitting in a hospital room they never expected to be in, or standing in a kitchen at 2 a.m. trying to figure out how to keep going, or lying awake beside someone they love, terrified of a diagnosis they haven't told anyone about yet. They don't know your name. They never will. But Padre Pio saw, over and over, across 50 years and thousands of letters and thousands of confessions, that this does not matter, that the current runs whether or not the two ends of it ever meet, whether or not either person ever learns what passed between them in the dark. There's another current Padre Pio spoke of, one that ran the opposite direction from all the others. Not what happens when you pray for a stranger, but what happens when a stranger prays toward you without your knowing it, calling out not in words, but in need, and something on the other end answers before a single word is spoken. During the war, it's said that Allied pilots preparing to bomb a target near his friary reported something none of them could explain in the official record. As they approached, a figure appeared in the sky in front of their aircraft, a bearded friar in a brown habit, arms outstretched, blocking their path with nothing but his presence. Pilot after pilot turned back, unable to release their payload, unable to explain to their commanding officers why the mission had failed. Years later, some of those same airmen traveled to the friary after the war, walked through the gate, and recognized, standing in front of them in the flesh, the same face they'd seen in the sky that day. Padre Pio, when asked directly whether he had been there, in that sky, at that hour, never denied it outright. He simply said that his body had never left the friary, that he had been in choir with the other friars at the very time the pilots described seeing him. 2 places, 1 man, a soul that could, it seems, answer a need it had never been told about in any language. You don't have to understand how that works to understand what it means. It means the current runs both ways, and it runs faster than distance should allow. It means someone in danger, someone in fear, someone who never said a formal prayer, but simply cried out inside themselves without words, might already have been heard by something moving toward them before they finished the thought. Padre Pio didn't claim credit for any of it. He deflected every question about his own gifts, with the same discomfort he showed about the wounds in his hands. But he never once said it wasn't real. He only ever said that it wasn't his doing, that whatever crossed that distance belonged to God, and he was simply the door it happened to walk through. That's the part people miss when they hear stories like this one. It was never about Padre Pio's own power. He said so plainly, over and over, to anyone who tried to treat him like a magician instead of a man who prayed. He was not the source. He was a conduit, a place where the current passed through more visibly than it usually does, so that the rest of us could catch a glimpse of what's always happening, quietly, underneath every ordinary prayer said for someone who will never know your name. That's what should unsettle you about a habit you've treated as small your whole life. Every time you've said, "I'll pray for you," and meant it, even carelessly, Even in passing, you were not performing a harmless social ritual. You were opening a door somewhere you couldn't see, in a world running directly underneath this one, and something walked through it. Padre Pio spent his whole life trying to get people to understand that the door is real, that it opens every single time, whether or not you ever learn what happened on the other side. When Padre Pio died, in the early hours of September 23, 1968, the friars who sat with him in his final moments heard him say two words, over and over, quieter each time. Jesus, Maria. Jesus, Mary. Not a plea for himself, not a cry of fear. The same two names he had likely whispered into thousands of strangers' burdens across 50 years, now spoken for his own passing, as if even at the very end he was still doing what he'd always done, handing a name to heaven and trusting it would be received. You would think that was the end of the current. A man who had spent his whole life as a door for other people's prayers, finally walking through one himself, gone. But that is not what happened, and it is not what the millions of people who still write to him today believe happened either. Letters still arrive at that friary by the thousands every year, addressed to a man who has been dead for decades, asking for exactly the same thing the living once asked of him in the confessional. Pray for me. Pray for my son. Pray for my mother, who is dying, and I don't know what else to do. The Church looked at this pattern for years. The reported healings, the sensed presences, the prayers that seemed, again and again, to be answered specifically in his name, and in 2002 declared him a saint. Not because the Church decided to grant him new power he hadn't had in life. Sainthood doesn't work that way. It was a recognition that the current he had spent his whole life describing was still running, undiminished by his death, because it had never actually belonged to him in the first place. It belonged to the same source it always had. He was simply, still, the door. That should change how you think about every prayer you've ever offered for a stranger, living or gone. Distance never stopped it. It turns out death doesn't either. A grandmother who died decades ago, a friend who passed before you got to say goodbye, a stranger from another century entirely. None of them are as far from you, in the world behind this one, as the empty chair at the table makes them seem. Padre Pio taught, and the Church has always taught alongside him, that the ones who have gone before are not gone from the current at all. They are simply on the other side of it now, praying back. Think for a moment about what it would mean to become the kind of person who does this on purpose, not by accident, not because a name happened to cross your path once, but as a practice, the way Padre Pio prayed for strangers as naturally as he breathed, until it stopped feeling like an act of will and simply became who he was. There's a man who started small, a single name each night, taken from a prayer chain he'd almost deleted from his phone without reading. He didn't feel anything the first night, or the second. He kept going anyway, mostly out of stubbornness, telling himself it cost him 30 seconds and nothing else. A month became 6 months. 6 months became years. He never met a single person on that list. He never learned what happened to most of them. But something in him changed that he didn't expect. He started noticing suffering he used to walk past without seeing. The tired cashier, the neighbor who hadn't left their house in weeks, the coworker whose jokes had gotten a little too sharp lately. He found himself praying for them too, unprompted, the names arriving in his mind the way a habit arrives in your hands before you've decided to reach for it. He hadn't set out to become someone who noticed people. He'd only set out to say a name each night. Padre Pio would have told him that's exactly how it works, that the current doesn't just move toward the person you're praying for. It moves through you on its way there, and it leaves something behind every time it passes. This is not a technique for feeling more spiritual. This is not a self-improvement program dressed up in incense. Padre Pio never taught that prayer for strangers exists to make the one praying feel better, though it often does. He taught that it exists because the need is real and the current is real. and refusing to take part in it doesn't make either one go away. It only means you're standing outside a door that was always meant to be walked through. There's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from believing no one is praying for you, and there's a specific kind of loneliness that comes from believing your own prayers for others don't matter. Padre Pio's entire life was an answer to both. He saw prayers arrive that no one thought would arrive. He saw strangers healed, comforted, converted, and steadied by names spoken by people they would never meet. And more than anything else, in 50 years of watching that current move, he never once reported seeing it fail to reach where it was sent. Delayed sometimes, different than expected, often, but never lost, never wasted, never nothing. There's a harder version of this same current, one Padre Pio never let people avoid no matter how much they wanted to. It's one thing to pray for a stranger you feel sympathy for, a sick child, a grieving mother, someone whose suffering is easy to imagine, because it could just as easily be yours. It's another thing entirely to pray for the stranger who wronged you, the driver who never stopped, the person who spread the rumor, the one whose face you can still see clearly enough to hate, years later, without even trying. Padre Pio was unflinching about this. He didn't treat forgiveness as a suggestion for the especially holy. He treated it as the price of admission to the very current he spent his life describing. A woman once came to him carrying decades of bitterness toward a man who had ruined her family's finances and never once apologized. She wanted Padre Pio to tell her she was right to hate him. Instead, he asked her a single question. "Have you prayed for him?" She said she couldn't. He said quietly, "Then start there and see what happens to you, not to him." She didn't want to hear that. Most people don't. But she did it anyway, reluctantly, won Our Father a night for a man she still couldn't stand to think about. She said, years later, that nothing about him ever changed. As far as she knew, he never learned she existed, never apologized, never even crossed her mind in any way that mattered to him. What changed was the weight she carried. It lifted, slowly, without her noticing exactly when, the way a stone in your shoe stops hurting only after you've walked far enough that you forget it's there. This is what Padre Pio meant when he said, "A prayer for a stranger reaches farther than you think." Sometimes it reaches the person you prayed for. Sometimes, just as truly, just as really, it reaches back into you and loosens something you didn't know was still holding on. Either way, the current moved. Either way, something that was closed found a way to open. He never asked anyone to pretend the hurt wasn't real. He never asked for forced smiles or hollow words. He asked only for the prayer, the plain, unglamorous act of saying a hard name toward heaven instead of just carrying it, alone, in your chest, for years. Not immediately, not dramatically, but it plants something. And once it's planted, it grows on a timeline that belongs to God, not to you, whether or not you ever see the harvest yourself. Padre Pio didn't just describe this current. He built an entire structure to carry it. In the years after the war, he founded what became known simply as the prayer groups, small circles of ordinary people, scattered eventually across the world, whose only purpose was to gather regularly and pray for the sick, the suffering, and the dying, most of whom none of them would ever meet. He called prayer, in this form, the best weapon we have, insisting that a single voice praying alone was strong, but that voices joined together, praying for strangers they would never know by name, carried a force he wanted the whole world to understand. Alongside those groups, he built something even more physical, a hospital, carved out of a mountainside in a poor region of southern Italy, where medical care had once been almost impossible to find. He called it the House for the Relief of Suffering. He wanted it built not merely as a place where bodies were treated, but as a place soaked in prayer, where the sick would be surrounded, day and night, by people interceding for them, many of whom had never laid eyes on the patients before that morning. He believed a hospital without prayer was only half a hospital. He wanted the whole current running through every ward, every bed, every stranger admitted through its doors. Think about the scale of what he was describing. Not one person praying for one stranger, occasionally, when a name happens to cross their path. An entire network of people, organized on purpose, praying in numbers for people none of them had ever met, day after day, decade after decade, long after his own death. If a single quiet prayer for a stranger reaches as far as the stories say it does, what happens when 100 people say the same name on the same night? What happens when a room full of strangers, joined only by their willingness to intercede, turns its attention toward one suffering person at the same hour? Padre Pio believed the answer mattered enough to spend the last decades of his life building the structure to make it happen on purpose, instead of leaving it to chance. He wasn't satisfied with individual kindness alone. He wanted a current so wide and so constant that no one suffering within reach of it would ever be praying entirely alone, even if every face around their bed was a stranger's. And here's the part that should stay with you longest. Those prayer groups never stopped when he died. They still meet today, in small parish halls and living rooms across dozens of countries, still holding the names of strangers up to God the way he taught them to, still following the same simple pattern he gave them. Gather, pray the rosary, offer intentions for the sick and the suffering, and trust the rest to hands they cannot see. Somewhere tonight, in a language you may not even speak, a circle of people you will never meet is very possibly praying for someone in your own family, or your own town, or your own hospital bed, without knowing a single detail about who you are, beyond a name written on a card and passed along a chain of strangers trying to help. You have likely been on the receiving end of this current more times than you will ever know, a recovery that surprised your doctors, a moment of unexplainable calm in the middle of a diagnosis that should have flattened you, a door that opened when every other one had closed, at exactly the hour you needed it to. You called it good luck, or good timing, or your own strength holding you up. Padre Pio would have asked you to consider a different explanation, that somewhere, a stranger you will never meet in this life had already said your name toward heaven, without needing your permission, without needing your thanks, simply because they believed the current was real and decided to add their voice to it. That is the world he spent his life describing. Not a world where prayer is a private transaction between you and God alone, sealed off from everyone else, useful only for your own concerns. A world where every person who has ever prayed sincerely for someone they've never met has quietly widened a river that every one of us is standing in, whether we notice it or not. You have already been carried by hands you will never shake. You have already been spoken for by voices you will never hear, and tonight, if you choose to, you can become one of those hands, one of those voices, for someone whose name means nothing to you yet, and everything to God.